So before I begin, I'd like to reiterate the thanks that the other speakers have given to Ken and Hiro for the very generous invitation and a very warm welcome here in Tokyo. On the 6th day before the Ides of May, 1585, Hara Martinho became a Roman. Overlooking the ruins of the Forum, where the orator Cicero had charmed and chastised his fellow citizens a millennium and a half before, the aspiring Japanese Jesuit, you see here on the right, and the 3 other members of the famous Tensho embassy, listened attentively to a long oration by a representative of the Senate, before each being presented with a vellum document, which gave them the right to bequeath the title of Roman patrician to their sons, nephews, and their descendants. However, the Roman citizenship was not the only thing that Martinho shared with Cicero. He was also an orator, and a Latin orator at that, having received from his Jesuit teachers in Japan and Europe at great expense of time and labor that Renaissance incarnation of Cicero's own education under Roman and Greek grammarians, rhetoricians, and philosophers. Today, Martinho is better known for his role in the Japanese translation of Luis de Granada's Guia de Pecadores and Simbolo de la Fe, and Thomas à Kempis de Imitazione Christi. What is perhaps less well understood is his position as the foremost Latin humanist among the Japanese Jesuits, and how and why a Japanese convert to Christianity mastered what we might call today the Western humanities, including those high standards of eloquence and the smattering of erudition required for humanist oratory. In other words, how did Hara Martinho become a Japanese Cicero Revidivus, the reincarnation of Cicero? Martinho was probably first exposed to the Western humanities as a member of the inaugural class in the Jesuit seminary of Arima, which from 1580 was housed in an abandoned Buddhist monastery in the shadow of the Hinue castle near Nagasaki. By the time he and his 4 companions in the embassy departed from Nagasaki for Europe in early 1582, the Arima ceremony had been open for less than 2 years. And so Martinho, then aged probably about 14, had probably learned little more than the rudiments of Latin and Japanese grammar, some music, as Charles was telling us, and of course, Christian doctrine. A typical day for the youngest students like Martinho involved rising with the sun at 4:30 a.m., putting on their handsome blue kimonos and white shoes, and attending Mass before studying lists of Latin vocabulary or some basic grammar between 6 and 7 a.m. Although we do not know which printed or manuscript textbooks were used by Martinho and his companions, we do have copies of the textbooks that were printed in the decades after the return of the embassy. We know, for example, that later Japanese students building their Latin vocabulary could have turned to an abridged version of Ambrogio Calapino's famous Latin dictionary, reprinted in a Latin, Portuguese, Japanese version in 1595 in the Jesuit colleges on the islands of Omaxa. The address to the reader in the Japanese edition makes the reasons for teaching Latin to the Japanese seminarians very clear. It says, in that thick, periodic style of Latin, which was typical of the time, the Jesuit fathers thought it was a suitable and advantageous way to achieve this, by which they mean the Christianization of Japan, if they not only imbued the Japanese boys with a knowledge of Orthodox Catholicism from a malleable age, since they possessed exceptional and outstanding talent, but also instructed them with examples of virtues, and finally put them through their paces in the gymnasium of Latinity, so that they could more easily drink of the many things that flow from Latin books, like from subterranean springs, which are good for an upstanding life and the spreading of the faith. Latin, then, was the key to accessing Christian truths. But to learn Latin in the Renaissance was not simply to acquire the means to decode words on the page. Rather, as the letter to the reader suggests, it was wrapped up in a Christian humanist intellectual project that combined Roman eloquence with the inculcation of virtues acquired by reading the best Christian, and of course pre-Christian, authors. As Martinho and his companions were native speakers of a non-Indo-European language, quite dissimilar to Latin in many ways, participating in this Jesuit project was going to present unique problems. But if we are to judge from the Amaxa edition of Manuel Alvarez's Latin grammar, printed just before the final prescription of Christianity in 1614, the Jesuit teachers did their best to assist Japanese pupils by providing additional explanations in Japanese and indeed in Portuguese for some of those more perplexing aspects of Latin grammar, such as the declensions and the conjugations, which you can see here. With some basic vocabulary and the rudiments of grammar, Martinho and his companions set sail for Europe as part of the Tensho embassy on one of the black carracks that brought the Namban, or southern barbarian trade, to Japan. During the multiple voyages that it took to reach Europe, when the conditions on board permitted, of course, they kept a similar routine to that of the Arima ceremony, with regular prayers, litanies, and study. As this floating humanist school bobbed its way across the Indian Ocean, the 4 Japanese seminarians studied longer Latin texts with their tutor and read vociferously during their hours of recreation to pass the time in that featureless maritime landscape. For students who had advanced beyond basic grammar and short introductory texts, the traditional humanist curriculum prescribed the reading of the best authors of antiquity. However, like Tertullian before him, Valeriano was deeply concerned about the effects of exposing his recruits to the heritage of both Jerusalem and Athens. In Rome, he reasoned, Christianity had of course grown up in the shadow of the Roman Empire, with its high regard for pagan eloquence and philosophy. This resulted in the fact that Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, and Seneca had become, by necessity, intrinsic to a Christian education. However, in Japan, the pagan classics were neither necessary nor desirable. Aristotle and Cicero were not names to conjure with in Japan as they had been in Europe, so they could be excluded, he thought, thereby also obviating the risk that the views of these pagan philosophers, so similar in many ways to Buddhism, might lead the Japanese into heresies. Again, we don't know which books their teacher, Diogo de Mesquita, packed for Martinho and his companions, whether from the seminary, Arima, or from his own personal library. Yet if we are to judge from Valeriano's choice of textbooks for the Japanese seminaries printed after their return, they were not entirely shielded from pagan antiquity. Rather, they were probably fed on a diet of expurgated, but always eloquent classical and humanist texts, such as those we find in the 1588 Macau edition of Juan Bonifacio's Christiani Puri Institutia, which you see here, which included carefully selected passages from Cicero, Horace, Juvenal, and even Ovid, the poet, as well as humanist authors like Angelo Poliziano, famous from the Italian Renaissance, and George of Trebizond. As they read their carefully selected classical and Christian authors, the 4 boys were probably also encouraged to keep commonplace books of notable passages from texts they had read. These manuscripts have, of course, long since vanished, but if they were anything like the commonplace book of Flosculi, printed at the Jesuit College in Nagasaki in 1610, they contained a large number of sententious phrases from Scripture, the Church Fathers, notable Christian authors, and from, I quote, the outstanding men of both Greece and Rome, all arranged under useful headings, such as wealth, the Eucharist, and youth, that could then be easily accessed and used in their Latin written exercises or in their declamations, which were spoken exercises. Although there is no evidence to suggest which classical authors Martinho and his companions mined for their Flores Rhetorici, we can be fairly sure that the models for Latin prose that were given the Japanese boys in Arima or during the voyage included Cicero's orations. This is because Cicero was only one of 2 classical authors to be disseminated actively by the Jesuits in Japan, the other being Virgil. Whereas Valeriano was probably keen to exclude Cicero's philosophical works for their accounts of ancient philosophical schools, He agreed with the authors of the Ratio Studiorum, who considered Cicero the only model of oratory. And from around 1592, we're told, such an edition was produced in Japan. With each of the boys following essentially a personalized version of the humanist curriculum, they all progressed to at least what in the later Ratio Studiorum would be called the humanities class, which prescribed the reading of longer texts from good classical and contemporary authors, and the production of more eloquent prose and verse according to these models. As humanist eloquence had a practical application in their newfound role as ambassadors, Mesquita set each of them tasks appropriate to their ability. He asked Martinho to compose a Latin oration for the Superior General of the Society of Jesus in Rome, while Mancio, the most senior member of the delegation, was charged with composing a shorter oration for the Pope. It is also clear by this stage that the Japanese boys were also familiar with the rules of Latin prosody, and were probably also reading some Latin poetry, as Mesquita had Miguel and Julião, the other two members of the embassy, compose Latin epigrams in praise of His Holiness, an ability famously also possessed by later Japanese seminarians, including Miguel Goto, who wrote these Latin elegiacs while in exile in the Philippines. Martinho's education in the Western humanities, of course, did not stop once the embassy reached Europe. And indeed, he must have received what amounted to a masterclass in humanist eloquence, as they participated in the great rituals of European diplomacy and ecclesiastical life, which always featured orations of the first water, some of which were actually printed. Although the boys begged to be allowed to stay in Rome to complete their education, their Jesuit mentors heeded Valeriano's wishes and pressed on with the return journey. After an unplanned delay in Mozambique due to unfavorable winds, the delegation arrived in Goa, the capital of the Estado da India, in mid-1587, where they were reunited with their patron Valeriano. In Goa, they were housed in the recently completed Jesuit College of St. Paul, the foremost center of humanist learning in the East, where generations of Jesuit missionaries destined for Japan or China completed their training. And it was here, where around a decade before Matteo Ricci taught Demosthenes' first Philippic oration in the college's short-lived Greek class, that it was decided that Martinho would publicly show his gratitude to Valeriano with a panegyric Latin oration. As panegyric rhetoric frequently has an underlying deliberative or exhortatory purpose, this was not only going to be an opportunity to massage the ego of the tall, imposing Neapolitan, or for Martinho to showcase the progress he had made during his long hours of study and in Japan and in Mesquita's humanist school on the high seas. It was also going to be an opportunity for Martinho to urge his fellow students to reaffirm their commitment to extending the reach of Christianity. Like all academic oratory, Martinho's oration was conventional and to an extent predictable. However, this doesn't mean that it didn't serve a serious purpose, hiding beneath a veil of commonplaces and Ciceronian exclamations, a powerful call to action. Probably delivered in the chapel of St. Paul's College, Martinho's classicizing oration had a suitably classicizing setting. Entering through a portal modeled on a triumphal arch, which is still preserved in Goa, and through a facade decorated with pairs of composite orders and geometric designs, the audience was presented with an interior painted so gleamingly white, it was said, that a single candle was enough to illuminate these coffered, classicizing barreled vaults. Borrowing an image from Seneca's De Beneficiis, Martinho's exordium, his beginning, also reworked classicizing material for contemporary ends. He began, "Not without due cause, most reverend Father, the ancients left to posterity that image of the graces, fashioned to show them with joyful faces and linked hands, dancing with each other in turn in a circle. With this image, these most learned and high-minded mortals sought to underline two laws above all, which must be observed in giving and receiving favors. Namely, that the giver should have a smile on their faces, and once the favor has been received, The recipients must then immediately return the favor with interest. This pagan mythological imagery, which had clearly not been hidden from the Japanese students during their education, was of course merely a point of reference and quickly led into a typical humanist refrain, quantum magus. If the pagans did this, then we as Christians should go so much further. What is more, Martinho continued, if Alexander of Macedon, Alexander the Great, declared that he owed no less to Aristotle, to whom he had been given to be educated as a child, than to his father Philip, since, although his father had given him life, his teacher had taught him how to live, how much more just, then, is it for us to confess frankly our gratitude to you, who chose us in particular to join the embassy to that part of the world from which, channeling the laws of good living and piety as if from its source, the underdeveloped nature given to us by our parents could flower into something more beautiful, refined, and polished. However, what opens as a panegyric of Valignano quickly reveals itself to be a panegyric of the Jesuits' evangelizing project in Asia that the Jesuit visitors spearheaded. As the oration progresses, Martinho makes it very clear the depths of superstition into which the Japanese had sunk, and the selfless efforts of the Jesuits to bring them to the true faith as he saw it. To remedy this, Valignano, their spiritual father in their new lives post-baptism, entrusted their education to the Jesuits in Japan, who, like the proverbial Spartan nursemaids so sought after in Athens, brought them up according to the strictest standards. From this point on, the oration then follows the narrative of the Tensho embassy. After the Spartan nursemaids have done their work, they return the Japanese boys to their spiritual mother, Rome, which then Martinho describes in detail. After praising the Pope and the College of Cardinals, Martinho then returns to the professed house of the Jesuits in the Eternal City, which he compares to the tree of Nebuchadnezzar, which, he tells us, in height reached the heavens, and in width the very edges of the earth. And due to the beauty of its leaves, the little birds of the sky sing merrily on its branches, and with its superabundance of fruit, it fed all the creatures of the earth. Like the vast tree described in the book of Daniel, the professed house in Rome reached up to heaven, from where it received divine support, and then stretched to the very ends of the earth. On its branches there sang not birds, but angels. The leaves with which it shaded the world were the leaves of virtue. Its fruit was so sweet that all the lost souls were attracted to it, he said, and it satiated them and dispelled the hunger of their depravity. It is no wonder, then, that kings and popes sought to support the tree. But what was most amazing, Martinho argued, was that despite its already vast dimensions, it was still growing. As the young Japanese humanist put it, however, what amazed us was that it was not content with the dimensions it had already reached, but sprouted new shoots every day, growing taller and promising even greater fruit in the future. When I consider the causes of this, it strikes me that it must be because it has running water, in Latin, aqua viva, at its feet, which assists and nourishes it. What's that, you say, he said? Does the Society of Jesus not have Claudium aqua viva, Claudium aquam vivam, in Rome as its general, by the plentiful waters of whose virtue and wisdom it sprouts new foliage and fruit? Seemingly overcome with joy at the prospect of the onward march of these crack Christian forces, Martinho embarked on a feverish panegyric of the missionaries being trained in Europe, imitating Cicero's description of the advantages of literature in his oration Pro Archia, an insight we owe to Professor Watanabe. In Martinho's words, then, as you can see at the bottom, the vast and famous colleges are full. Full too are the many professed houses, made rich and noble by their vows of poverty. Full, finally, are the seminaries, which can all be observed and studied with the eyes, but in their dignity cannot be fully described or comprehended. You then compare this to Cicero. The books are full of it. Full too are the views of the philosophers. Full also are the examples from history, which would never see the light of day if they were not written down. Cutting himself short in the self-aware fashion of a humanist orator, Martinho ended his account of Rome and the Jesuits with a prayer and a series of exclamations regarding the military might of the Jesuits. O glorious society, O noble encampment of pious men, a well-drilled battle line of forces. As the oration drew to a close, the final peroration was directed equally to the hordes of aspiring Jesuits, Japanese or otherwise, who sat behind Valignano, that tall Neapolitan aristocrat. Idolatry was on the verge of defeat, and seminarians need only follow their heroic general Valignano into battle to be assured of victory. As Martinho told them, that Alexander, who was given the epithet the Great due to his power, after he subdued a part of India, admiring the areas he had conquered by force of arms, that great general of noble bent is said to have wept, for Anaxagoras asserted that there was another world which no warrior could ever reach, a task for which Alexander felt himself inadequate. Yet you, Alessandro, not merely great, but far greater than the Great One, have conquered and subdued almost all of India with the arms of Christ. Now Japan stands before you. It will not easily be brought to heel except by an Alexander. So now advance into Japan with that great army of almost heavenly warriors which you command. Take the province by divine force, lay it low with virtue, rip our oppressed homeland from the hands of the savage enemy, and restore it to true liberty. The Japanese call out to you and long for you. The wind is at your back. The seas are calm. The doors are open. See, beloved father, do not delay. Marchons. As humanist rhetorical theory tells us, and Martinho shows us, in a short panegyric oration, the peroration need not rehearse the arguments. Instead, its full force can be applied to opening the rhetorical floodgates, to move the hearts of any remaining doubters in the audience. Following the footsteps of Alexander, Martinho's listeners were to fall in line behind Valignano and lay siege to paganism's final citadels in Japan. As we follow Martinho's journey from Nagasaki to Rome and back again, we see the young Jesuit Japanese seminarian being equipped with the persuasive tools to win souls for Christ in Asia. As we know, of course, Martinho's hopes were going to be dashed. Forced into exile in 1614 with many of his confreres, he lived out the rest of his life in Macau, far from his homeland. As a preacher, historian, and translator, even in these final years, Martinho continued to be the very model of the eloquent, erudite, and trilingual Jesuit that Valignano had envisaged when he set about building an indigenous clergy. A Japanese Jesuit, then, and a humanist, who could lay claim to being the first and the foremost Cicero Revidivus. Thank you.